Have a seat real quick, and let me introduce to you our guest today. Man, you are today going to be so blessed to hear from the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. And so I've been kidding around with President Anderson backstage saying, you are our Pope. For all of us that are Protestants, you're our like non-Catholic Pope, you know? And so he's just an incredibly gracious pastor and author. And last night I had the privilege of getting to spend some time with them at dinner, and Miss Anderson and Mr. Anderson just blessed me. It was pretty awesome for me and for Ian and Dan from our team of OSP to just sit. Really, honestly, I felt like we were sitting by people who've just done it a lot longer than we had. And I would make a comment, and he would just make a comment back about my comment. And I'll be honest, when we got done with dinner, I just went and sat in my car, took out my notepad on my phone, and just tried really quickly to write down everything that you said, because it just felt like God was just pouring wisdom, just wisdom into my life. And everything he would say just felt so biblically centered and so God glorifying. And so I'm just grateful that God has given us a leader that really represents us as evangelicals with just such a great way. And I love that, by the way, that we have an association like that. You know, Jesus' last prayer for us in the garden, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he knew he was about to go through the crucible of the cross, was that we would be one. That we as his children would put secondary things away, that the Methodist and the Presbyterian and the Charismatic, all of us, the children of God, would become an association of people carrying out the Great Commission as evangelicals. And so we need a leader. We need an apostolic leader who will speak and gather us together. And Leif has done an incredible job at that. And so not just President Anderson, but Miss Anderson, we're so honored to have you. We are glad that you're here. Get out your notepads, as I did last night. And can we just put our hands together for our brother, Leif Anderson. Thank you, sir.
So it's the 21st century, and we are in Lynchburg with a population of 78,000 in a metropolitan area with 250,000, and a nickname for Lynchburg that it is the city of 7 hills. So let's travel 20 centuries back in time, 4,650 miles to the east, to a population of 1 million people in the first century in the city of 7 hills, Rome. Rome was a pagan place. Christian values were little known or followed. The Roman pantheon had all of its gods and idols. Immorality, it was not only rampant, but it was a part of official worship. Dishonesty in business was normal. Corruption was pervasive. Marital morality was minimal. Divorce or abandonment were frequent. The cities, they were dangerous and filthy places. Most everyone lived in tenements that were made out of wood. They were prone to fire. It was before sanitation. It was before plumbing. The highest rent was on the highest floor because people threw all of their waste out the window, and you wanted to be upstairs rather than downstairs when they did that. Virtually every family had children die. And virtually everyone in the Roman Empire lost at least one parent before they reached maturity. Modern birth control, it was unknown. Abortion, it was far more frequent than anything that we have in America today. And because medical procedures were primitive, there was no anesthesia, germ theory had not been developed, soap had not been invented, that when abortions took place, if the woman survived, the chances were high that she would have rampant infection and be left sterile. Infanticide, it was common. It was kind of one of the primary ways of birth control. And it was almost exclusively female infants. So they would wait until a baby was born, see if it was a boy or a girl, and if it was a boy and value, that child was kept, and if it was a girl, she would be taken out to the seashore and left on the sand, or taken up to the hills to die of exposure during the night. The long-term result of that was that in adulthood, the number of men in the Roman Empire significantly outnumbered the number of women. Epidemics, far greater than anything that we fear threatened today with Ebola. Then it was smallpox and measles and bubonic plague. We know that some of those epidemics wiped out half of the population of Roman cities. And then, when Roman cities were depopulated, the Roman Empire would send out its army and would force migrations, tens of thousands of people who were forced into Roman cities to repopulate them. People who had no place to live, didn't speak the language, didn't have jobs. In those days, the Roman Empire was pretty tolerant of everybody else's religion. Unlike many of the ancient empires, you could retain your religion as long as you were loyal to Caesar. And Christianity was considered to be sort of a denomination of Judaism, and so initially it was tolerated and accepted. But increasingly, the government turned against Christians. An historic date was July 19th, AD 64. The city of Rome burned with a vengeance. It kept burning for 72 hours. The tenements were destroyed. Tens, probably hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. And there was a rumor that went out in the streets of Rome that the person behind this devastation was actually their own emperor, Nero. That he had decided that if he destroyed the city, he could rebuild the city, and then it would be a tribute to him for all of history. In fact, it was said that Nero was sending out Roman soldiers who would stop the firefighters from putting out the fires, and that they would reignite the fires where they had been put out. When Nero heard of it, he realized that he was losing his political base in his own capital city. And so he decided to turn the responsibility to the Christians. He needed someone else to blame. Up until then, Christianity was relatively accepted, but there were sort of hidden rumors about Christians. It was said that they were cannibalistic because they would have secret meetings and they would eat the flesh and drink the blood of their leader. That they were immoral, that they had repeated sexual orgies, and that was based upon the fact that they said that they all loved one another. That Christians were anti-family because you were to hate your father and mother out of loyalty to your leader, Jesus. So Nero took these misunderstandings and this prejudice and announced that the Christians had burned the city. He authorized and then ordered severe persecution. A lot of what we know comes from the Roman historian Tacitus. He says that under Nero's orders, Christians were captured and they were sewn into the raw and bloody skins of animals, and then they were fed to wild dogs who would rip them to death. That they were crucified in such large numbers that you could stand on the road and the crosses were as far as you could see. It was beyond sight. That Nero had Christians covered in oily pitch and then put on crosses or hooks and lit on fire so that he could have his garden parties in the imperial gardens illumined at night. Tacitus says that the worst of criminals felt sympathy for the treatment of Christians because it was so severe. That was in AD 64. 3 years later, in AD 67, Peter wrote in our New Testament book of 1 Peter, chapter 2, verses 9 to 12, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may desire the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Okay, so that's us. Yeah, it was them, but that's us that Peter is talking about. That as Christians, these are adjectives that describe who we are and how we behave. Peter says, we are chosen to be on God's team. I've never really been a very good athlete. I did get a varsity letter in high school, but barely. And I remember in grade school, in physical education classes, that teachers or others would pick a couple of people to be team captains, and then they would pick who they wanted. And I remember the agony of not being picked. And as the two teams would develop, there was a camaraderie that built up, and they were excited and enthusiastic, and the numbers of us not being picked became fewer and fewer. And you sort of hope and pray that you won't be the last one who is chosen. But I remember a few times when I was chosen first, that somebody was up there and they said my name, and I was picked to be on their team. And it was this sense of thrill, of exhilaration. Not because I was a good athlete, because the person doing the picking was my friend. This is somebody who liked me, who cared about me, and who chose me. That's what we're being told. You are a chosen people. It is saying that God picked you for his team. Picked you for his team, not because you're good, not because of what you can do, but because he likes you, because he wants you on his team, because you are a high choice. He loves you. He chose you. Peter says, and more than that, you're a royal priesthood. You know, when you call an 800 number and you're trying to get some satisfaction, and you get into this voicemail continuum, and you try until eventually it starts all over again, and you're just frustrated, and it's important, and you need to talk to somebody. And you start to imagine, what if I could have the private number of the CEO of the company? What if I could have the PIN number to access somebody who really knows and somebody who's really important and can make the decision? That's what God has given to Christians. That we have a priesthood, direct access, God's private number, his PIN. And it's the royal priest, that we're actually part of the family of Jesus Christ the King. And we're a holy nation, holy being different. That is, we're like God, really different from everybody else. You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. A people belonging to God. You probably missed it because it wasn't really all over the news, but in February of this year, there was a really interesting auction story about a Harley-Davidson motorcycle that sold at auction for $327,000. Now, I don't know what you think a used Harley is worth, but that seems like a lot. It was a 2013 Custom Dyna Super Glide. Manufacturer's suggested retail price, $13,000. So why would any even wealthy person spend $327,000 for a used motorcycle that you can buy new for $13,000? Except it turns out that Harley was previously owned by Pope Francis. And there's no indication that he ever even rode on it. It just belonged to him. And so the value is determined not by the manufacturer's suggested retail price, but on who owned it. That's the Bible's principle, that as Christians, we have this enormous value to God. Call it billions and billions of dollars, but it's not enough to state the worth that you belong to God. So that's who we are as Christians. We're described as holy, but it's not just who we are, it's what we do. And that's what they were saying in the Roman Empire, that we're different not only in our relationship to God, but different in our behavior. So if we're Christians, then we live as Christians. We live as those who are chosen to be on God's team. We live as those who are royal priests. We live as those who are holy. We live as those who have an infinite value. And as a result, we are to abstain from certain desires and behaviors, and we're to do good deeds. And we are to glorify God. Okay, I will confess to you that I use that term an awful lot, and if anybody asked me to define it, I couldn't. And so I did my own personal research. English word glorify comes from a Greek word doxa. In classical Greek, it had to do with a person's reputation. So to glorify God is to enhance God's reputation. It's to make God look good. Not that we can ever improve on a God who is perfect in all of his characteristics and attributes. We can't, but his reputation is often far distant from the reality of who God is. So what we say and do and how we live brings God's reputation into closer alignment with the realities of God. So to glorify God is to make God look good. That's what holy Christians do. In those early centuries, holy Christians lived moral lives in a pagan culture. Husbands and wives were faithful to each other. They avoided divorce. Women were uncharacteristically, for that culture, treated with dignity and respect. They didn't have abortions. They kept and they loved girl babies. So when a girl baby was born in a Christian family, she was never abandoned. Christians would go out during the night. They would stay up all night and they would roam the beaches and go up into the hills and they would listen for the cry of a newborn infant. And they would find her and they would bring her home and adopt her into their family and raise her to come to faith in Jesus Christ. It was such a contrast to what was happening in the broader Roman culture. Pagans, because of the shortage of women for marriage, began having marrying ages younger and younger. Many girls never went outside. They never went outside in their lives. So they were in their home, their father's home. They were married around 11 or 12 years old, and they were moved into the home of their new husband and would spend then the rest of their lives in his home, because if they went outside, the chances were they would be kidnapped, because there was such a shortage of women to become brides that they were continually at risk. Christians and the church, by contrast, established a marrying age for women of 18 to 20 years old and insisted that they be virgins when they were married. So while the pagan world had an increased shortage of women, the church had an increased supply of women. If you're an economics major, you would say that the church cornered the female market of the Roman Empire. And the church discovered that by the thousands and tens of thousands, a lot of young men started showing up at church, because that was the place they could find women. What they may not have expected was the church insisted that their Christian women could not marry unbelievers. And so they had to go through a lengthy process, a catechism. They had to learn the doctrines, and they had to be baptized and declare their faith before they could marry a Christian woman. When the plagues hit the cities, the standard approach to public health was to get out of town. So if you're in the marketplace and you heard that there was a smallpox epidemic that was coming, or there was bubonic plague that had been discovered, pagan people, they wouldn't even go home. They would just leave. They would get as far from home and from the city as they could. They'd go up into the mountains or somewhere else along the seashore so that they could survive. The difficulty was that at home, they had elderly parents, they had disabled family members, they had young children. They just abandoned them. Many of them didn't die of the plague, they died of neglect, they died of starvation because no one was there to take care of them, except the Christians. Christians, sometimes at the risk and the loss of their lives, would stay behind. They would go to the homes, they would provide for the elderly, they would take care of the disabled, they would feed and clothe and care for the young children that had been abandoned. And when, a long time later, sometimes months, sometimes many months, those who had left the city would come back, they would discover that their own family members had turned to faith in Jesus Christ because they had experienced the Christian love that their own families didn't provide. Or how about when the cities were repopulated? When slaves, sometimes millions of slaves, were brought in from the far reaches of the empire to repopulate the cities. When the government wouldn't provide for them, the church did. The church has historically always been a place for those who were immigrants, a place that was safe and would be cared for, where you would be welcome, where you could find a job and a home to stay in and someone who would teach you the language. And so the immigrants, again, in large numbers, started to come to Christian faith. And the long-term result of all of this was amazing. As a college student, when I studied the history of Western civilization, I'm not sure a professor or a book said it, but I don't know, I sort of got the impression that this pagan Roman Empire became Christian because in February of AD 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, and the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, and the emperor himself eventually became a Christian. So I assumed it was a political decision. In a provocative and powerful book by Rodney Stark, who, when he wrote it, was a professor at the University of Washington, he argues that isn't what happened at all. What happened was the emperor realized that there were so many Christians living good and godly lives in the empire that everything had turned and changed, and he had no other political choice. There were so many Christians that he had to declare Christianity legal in the empire. Okay, so how did that work? All right, let me just switch us for a moment to be a quick statistics class and say that Stark says in AD 40, he estimates, there were 1,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. You know, if you want to pick at it, you can say, well, there were 3,000 on Pentecost, and that was before AD 40. And so, but just grant him that. Let's say there were 1,000 followers of Jesus in the year AD 40. If that's correct, it represented 17 1,000th of 1% of the population. Statistically, totally insignificant. So go 160 years later, that's a long time, to the year 200. The number of Christians had grown significantly, from 1,000 to 218,000. That's the population of metropolitan Lynchburg, 218,000. But, you know, percentage-wise, it still wasn't much. 36 100ths of 1% of the population of the empire. But the church kept growing. You know, it's the law of compounding. If you were fortunate enough to have $1,000 and you can invest it, if you can get 7% interest, it'll double in 10 years. If you can get 10% interest, it'll double in 7 years. And the law of compounding for holy and godly living was at work. So the Stark says by the year AD 350, there were 33.9, called 34 million Christians in the Roman Empire, representing over 56% of the population. The majority of people in the Roman Empire had become followers of Jesus. So how did they do that? How did they go from 1,000 to 56 million? How did they go from being crucified, persecuted, burned at the stake, to becoming the most dominant force and influence in the entire Roman Empire? They lived holy lives. As aliens and strangers in the world, they abstained from sinful desires and lived such good lives among the pagans that though they were accused of doing wrong, the pagans saw their good deeds and they glorified God. They made God look good. Okay, So that was then, we live now. What about us? So how are we doing? Well, what kind of lives are Christians living today? I would say that there are millions of Christians who are living holy lives and making a difference. So I look back in the history of this nation. 150 years ago, slavery was legal in America until abolitionist Christians put their lives on the line for human freedom. Or go back 100 years. Do you know that 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 1900s, that heroin and syringes were sold through the Sears and Roebuck catalogs and were mailed by the United States Postal Service? Until there were Christians who called for a new way without these addictions. Or 50 years ago, theological liberalism dominated the religious landscape of this nation. Born-again Christians were marginalized and on the edges of society. We've seen a complete turnaround. Those committed to a liberal theology are in churches that are diminishing in numbers, and those who are committed to the Bible, who are evangelical Christians, are seeing churches explosively increase in numbers. There's hardly a place that you can go in America where there isn't a new evangelical church, in a school, in a storefront, in some place that they could easily rent. And for immigrants, America has become a major destination of immigrants, and we are seeing that immigrants in this country are not only bringing the gospel with them from Asia and from Latin America, but significant numbers of immigrants who have come and are coming to this country are becoming believers. So one day, I was sitting at home, and I was reading the Bible, I was praying, and I read Acts chapter 2, the story of Pentecost. And it was a surprise to them. It was a miracle of the Holy Spirit. 3,000 people became believers in one day. And I got thinking that for a lot of time after that, when persecution was severe, there must have been a lot of Christians who looked back to that once upon a time and said, even though it's really hard now, once upon a time there was a day, the great day never to be repeated, when there were 3,000 new believers in one day. As I thought about it, I remembered some statistics that I had just read. That on a typical day, like today, there are 32,000 new followers of Jesus in the People's Republic of China. That in Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, there are 20,000 new Christians every day. Every day. That in South America, 10,000 new believers every day, 365 days of the year, and 50,000 new churches per year in South America, almost 1,000 new churches every week. So I took this and some other numbers, and I added it up, and I divided it by 24, and came up with a number in excess of 3,000. That is to say that you and I live at a time when there is a Pentecost every hour. Since we came into this room, there has been a Pentecost around the world. More than 3,000 people in the last hour. There has never, ever been anything like this in all of the last 2,000 years of history. So analysts are saying that the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century will go down as the record of the greatest Christian spiritual awakening in all of history, because Christians are doing it again. We are living holy lives that enhance the reputation of God and impresses pagans to come to salvation in Jesus Christ. But sometimes people say to me, yeah, well, you know, Christianity in America is 3,000 miles wide and it's an inch deep. I got to tell you, that's not my experience. That's not my experience at all. I find that wherever I go, there are deeply committed followers of Jesus Christ who are doing precisely what they did in the first century in the Roman world. I find that I am stunned sometimes. You know, the tragedy of Columbine High School occurred, I was in Littleton, Colorado that day, and went to the perimeter fence around the high school campus, and there were thousands and thousands of notes there. Spent hours reading them, and they were quotes of Bible verses. They were testimonies to faith in Jesus Christ. September 11th, when the World Trade Center was taken down, there were more testimonies for faith in Jesus Christ that rose up across America than any time that most people can remember. Let me just tell you, the next time there's a massive hurricane, or when the tornadoes sweep through Oklahoma and other states, when there's a flood, when there's a massive fire, watch the interviews that take place on network television. And you will find that sometimes the reporters are stunned because those who are in the worst difficulty and tragedy of their lives profess faith in Jesus Christ and a confidence that God is there in the midst of the greatest of difficulties. So I'm awed by the lives of Christians facing unexpected tragedies. They are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that they may declare the praises of him who called them out of darkness into his wonderful light. May this be you. May this be you. May you live a holy life that enhances the reputation of God. There's a story about a brilliant young pianist. He was 17 years old. Word was out in the music community of London. And so when a recital hall with 1,000 seats was booked for his initial concert, it was completely sold out. They say it was no disappointment that he was spectacular, just brilliant, a prodigy. And when he finished his recital, that the audience burst into applause, standing ovation. He slipped off the bench at the grand piano and went through the curtains. And the stage manager said to him, "Wow, what a great response. You need to get out there and play an encore." He said, "I don't have anything else to play. I'm not going back out there." The stage manager said, "Listen, there are 1,000 people who are out there, and they are all standing and applauding you. You need to go back out." And he said, "They're not all standing or applauding." The stage manager said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There's a gray-haired man up in the balcony, seated, with his arms folded." So the stage manager looked through the curtains, and sure enough, there's one guy sitting up in the balcony. So he came back and said to the pianist, "Okay, there are 999 people out there who are standing and applauding you. What difference does that one guy in the balcony make?" He said, "He's my teacher." There was another prodigy, not a musician, but a preacher. His sermon is one of the best that was ever preached and one of the longest that's recorded in the Bible. When he finished, they did not applaud him. They picked up rocks to kill him. It's all recorded in Acts chapter 7. When they heard his sermon, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Doesn't the Bible usually say that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God? Look, Stephen said, "I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." May you live such holy lives, even in a pagan world, that someday Jesus will stand for you. God our Father, when that day comes, I pray for every person here to be the holy and loyal and godly follower of Jesus, who delights your heart and for whom Jesus stands. In his name, amen.